Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that further proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to continue the discussion of cybersecurity legislation, and particularly S. 3414, which is the pending business before the Senate, which is the Cybersecurity Act of 2012, a bipartisan piece of legislation to deal with an urgent national crisis. Mr. President, I wanted first again to speak to our colleagues about the seriousness of the threat. I think sometimes that because most people haven't experienced the consequences of a cyber attack, and most are not aware of the constant cyber theft going on, moving money from bank accounts, stealing industrial secrets, because frankly a lot of the businesses that are the victims of the thefts don't want to acknowledge them or announce them for fear of exposing their own lack of adequate cyber defenses, but also a kind of general embarrassment. And yet we now know as a public matter, whether it's sunk into consciousness among most of the American people, that some great companies that are very tech-savvy, cyber-savvy, have been the victims of cyber attacks. Sony was, RSA, Google, and others that have come momentarily to public attention. But what this has meant has been, I think, unclear to people, so that, and it may in fact be unclear to many of the leaders of the private corporations that control so much of our critical cyber infrastructure. In America, 80 to 85% of the critical infrastructure is privately owned. That's the American way, and that's the way it ought to be. But it means that when the private sector owns critical infrastructure, which can, in this new world of ours, and will be, a target of hostile action, enemy attack, then we've got to create a partnership with the private owners of this critical infrastructure to raise our defenses, because it's not just their businesses that they're defending, it's the security of the United States. A chief information officer at one of the businesses that owns a part of our critical infrastructure said to me at one point that it's hard to get the attention of the CEO to this problem. The CEO is balancing a lot of considerations, looking at quarterly annual budgets, quarterly profits. For the average CEO, the threat of cyber attack is distant. For the average chief information officer, it's not so distant. As the majority leader pointed out earlier today, I think it may help to look at something very difficult to look at, which is what's happening in India today, where the power system has collapsed for hundreds of millions of people. That is a breakdown, as far as we know, and I believe that's what is the fact. That's a breakdown in parts of the electric grid. But and let me give another example. Last year in Connecticut, we had a very serious early winter storm, where there were still a lot of leaves on the trees. The branches were heavy. A lot of the trees fell, and they took out a lot of power lines in our state. And a lot of people were without power for days and days and days and days. Public buildings were used as shelters for the homeless. Elderly people particularly were affected, the food spoiling in the refrigerator, the lack of lights in their dwelling, etc. Now just imagine for a moment if that was not the result of a weather event, but of a cyber attack. Because cyber systems are controlling the electric power grid. And I believe it's vulnerable. I think the same of a lot of the other cyber systems that control critical infrastructure. in our financial system, all the computer systems that we depend on for the movement of money from one account to the other, the direct deposits we do, the money that's in our accounts, the billions of dollars that move between financial institutions every day. What would happen to our country if those systems were knocked out, or Wall Street, the stock exchanges were knocked out? And again, as I said earlier today, think about the real nightmare situation, which is that a dam controlled by a cyber system is penetrated by an enemy who opens the dam and unleashes water, torrents of water that knock out communities in the path of that water and kills a lot of people. That's all, unfortunately, the age that we live in and the vulnerability that we have. There was a story in the Washington Post, I believe I've talked about it in this debate before, but I repeat it now because it was jarring, that there was a young man on the other side of the world sitting at his computer at home, and he, with nothing special, but he's smart, he was computer savvy, he broke into the computer control system, the cyber system controlling a small water utility in Texas. He had the ability to disrupt the functioning of that entire utility. He didn't do it, thank God. He posted online what he had done. A warning at least, perhaps a bit of bragging that he was able to do it. But think about an enemy that had hostile intent against the United States who had launched similar attacks against several small utilities around the country, or large utilities for that matter. Mr. President, last week the people who are the real experts on cyberspace gathered in Las Vegas at the annual, and this is an interesting title, Black Hat Computer Security Conference, and they issued yet more warnings. The conference opened with a very strong warning from Sean Henry, who until recently was the Assistant Director of the FBI in charge of the FBI's considerable cyber programs. Some people called Sean Henry the nation's top cyber cop. He said at the conference, the Black Hat Conference, the adversary knows that if you want to harm civilized society, take their water away, do away with their electricity. There are terrorist groups that are online now calling for the use of cyber as a weapon. And Mr. Henry went on, people will not truly get this until they see the real implications of a cyber attack. For example, people knew about Osama bin Laden prior to 9/11, but that awareness rose by several orders of magnitude after the attacks. And Mr. Henry, Sean Henry, former director of cyber programs at the FBI, concluded, I believe something like that will have to happen in the cyber world before people truly get it, end of quote. Well, obviously, we all hope and pray not. But at this moment in this debate and the Senate's consideration of the Cybersecurity Act, as a lot of kind of inflexible positions are being taken, people are not willing to come together across ideological and political divides to deal with a problem and a threat that faces us all. I fear that Mr. Henry may well have been right. So, Mr. President, I urge my colleagues, don't run the risk that it'll take a cyber 9/11 to bring us rushing back here to adopt cybersecurity legislation. It doesn't take much to imagine what will happen if we are the victims of a major cyber attack. Minor cyber attacks are happening every day. Major cyber thefts are occurring regularly in America every day. Let's heed the warning and come together over special interest to meet a national security interest and challenge. I thank the chair. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Mr. Okaka. Mr. President.
Senator from Florida.
Mr. President, I want to address...
Senator Quorum calls.
Thank you, Mr. President. I request consent that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, may I be recognized?
Senator from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I just started to launch into this because there is such an important subject that is looming over the country right now, and the Congress can do something about it, and that is the possibility of cyber attack. We have had this discussed by a number of people in very high responsible positions, and the threat is real, and what the threat means to all of us in our everyday lives is the fact that electrical systems could be shut down, water systems could be shut down, the banking system could be shut down, sewer systems could go awry, and you can go on and on, Mr. President, as to the possibility of what is happening. And here for months we have been stymied from passing anything here because of a disagreement in the business community, which is going to be one of the main recipients of the potential cyber attack. Now, I will choose my words very carefully as a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee and say this potential attack is real. And it's real not only from rogue players, but also some state actors. And we need to get this legislation up and going. And I am most encouraged to think that we are at a position that we're going to get agreement, that the chairman and the vice chairman of our Intelligence Committee are going to come together in an agreement, and we need to pass this week because this is deadly serious. Now, I just want to refer to a letter that has been made public by the commander of Cyber Command, four-star General Keith Alexander. He is also the head of the National Security Agency, and he has done a remarkable job. And I just want to point out the letter that he has sent, dated today, to the Majority Leader, imploring the Senate to move, and I will submit this letter for the record instead of reading it. But he points out, and this is somebody who knows because this is the head of the National Security Agency. So, Mr. President, I want to bring that to the attention of the Senate, and whatever disagreements that have been over the concern of the Department of Homeland Security being the interfacing agency, those disagreements can be worked out. The National Security Agency, which almost all of us have enormous confidence in, is going to be directly involved, and it is my hope, and I'm expressing optimism, that we're going to get this legislation out of here and get it down to the House. And if they can't pass it before this August recess, at least we can have some items over the August recess start to be informally conferenced to iron out any differences between the House and the Senate. Mr. President, I'm actually waiting for Senator Durbin, who wanted to speak on another subject, and until he comes, I am going to go ahead and start. And this is over the recent death of Oswaldo Paya, a Cuban dissident, and his untimely death in Cuba in a supposed automobile accident. The Cuban people, indeed all free-loving peoples of the world, have recently lost a great advocate for freedom, and he was someone that was in peaceful opposition to the tyranny that is on the island of Cuba. Oswaldo Paya died in a car crash on Sunday, July the 22nd. He was just 60 years old. Another Cuban dissident, Harold Cepero, was also killed in the accident, and two European politicians, one from Spain and one from Sweden, were injured. Paya was one of Cuba's best-known dissidents. He pushed for civil and human rights. He pushed for an end to one-party rule. He pushed for freedom for political prisoners, and he pushed for support for private businesses. And in 2002, his Varela project delivered more than 24,000 verifiable signatures in support of these ideals to the Cuban government. It was the largest petition drive in Cuban history. And Paya, he bravely led this initiative at great risk to himself, to his loved ones, and to his colleagues. And for his work, he received the European Parliament's Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought in 2002, and he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, Mr. President, the reason I am bringing this up, other than pointing out that planet Earth has lost a friend for freedom, is to note that the circumstances of the car accident are the topic of some debate. Cuban officials insist that the driver was speeding and that he lost control and he hit a tree. But others are saying that witnesses saw another vehicle hit Mr. Paya's vehicle and drive it off the road. Paya's daughter, Rosa Maria, says that she holds the Cuban government responsible. She's told CNN that we think it's not an accident. They wanted to do harm and then ended up killing my father. That's a direct quote. Paya's loved ones and the Cuban people and the international community deserve to have all the facts surrounding this tragic event examined and put out in the public. And that's why I've introduced, along with a number of our colleagues, S-Res 525, which honors the life, legacy, and exemplary leadership of Oswaldo Paya. This resolution also calls on the Cuban government to allow an impartial third-party investigation into the accident. I urge the Senate to unanimously pass this resolution. This request comes on the heels of other disturbing news out of Cuba. We've learned that more than 40 pro-democracy activists were detained after Payá's funeral last Tuesday. The reason? They dared to shout libertad, freedom, during the ceremony. And reports also indicate that several of the dissidents were severely beaten. These peaceful activists are only honoring one of their own, and they ended up as victims of an authoritarian regime. So now more than ever before, the United States must continue policies that promote the fundamental principles of political freedom, democracy, and human rights, all of which Oswaldo Payá devoted his life. And I'm particularly, and Senator Durbin, I've already mentioned that I was awaiting your leadership to speak out on the issue because we're quite concerned that the Castro regime continues to hold an American hostage, Alan Gross. And once again, another senator rises to urge the Cuban regime in the strongest possible terms to immediately and unconditionally release him. We will never forget Payá's passion and dedication to freedom and faith, and the least the regime can do is to release Alan Gross. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I thank my colleague, Senator Durbin, and the senator from Rhode Island to be here to speak out on this issue. Thank you.
The senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I am here this afternoon to speak about the Cybersecurity Act of 2012, the measure that is on the Senate floor right now. This important bill addresses a serious and immediate threat to our nation's security. I served 4 years on the Intelligence Committee, during which I worked hard to understand the cybersecurity threat. I helped Senator Mikulski and Senator Snowe write the Senate Intelligence Committee cybersecurity report. I am the chairman of the Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime and Terror that has jurisdiction over cybersecurity, and as I have explained before on the floor of the Senate, the cyber threat against our nation, against our intellectual property, against our privacy, and against our safety is vast, and it is upon us. It is a national security threat. It is a national economic threat. We cannot afford to wait to pass legislation to respond to this threat. The leading national security experts in each party agree now is the time to pass comprehensive cybersecurity legislation. The Cybersecurity Act is a strong, comprehensive bill that will make our nation safer. It will provide for the sharing of threat information among the government and private sector, and it will provide for the hardening, for the protection of the networks of the private companies that operate America's critical infrastructure, that run our electric grid, that run our financial networks, that run our communication systems, and the other infrastructure that is essential to conducting the day-to-day way of life that Americans enjoy, that is essential to our national security and to our economic well-being. The Senate voted to proceed to this bill in a very broad bipartisan manner, 84 votes, as I recall. It has been disappointing in the wake of that some elements within the business community are failing to cooperate, are failing to, for instance, provide constructive suggestions in areas where they have disagreement with this important legislation. Indeed, some appear intent on just preventing the Senate from passing legislation that would make us all safer. In some cases, these interests are not negotiating to get a bill that protects their interests. They're blockading to stop a bill that will protect all of our interests. To put this blockade into context, consider the views of General Keith Alexander, Director of the National Security Agency and Commander of the United States Cyber Command. General Alexander is the most senior and respected cybersecurity expert in our nation's military. He runs our two most technically sophisticated and skilled cyber operations, and today he wrote to the Senate leadership, "The cyber threat facing the nation is real and demands immediate action. The time to act is now. We simply cannot afford further delay. Moreover, to be most effective in protecting against this threat to our national security, cybersecurity legislation should address both information sharing and core critical infrastructure hardening." End quote. Well, the Cybersecurity Act addresses both of those issues, information sharing and core critical infrastructure hardening. It does what our military's leading cybersecurity expert says is necessary to be done to protect the nation. That, then, is the view of the leader of our military cyber warriors and cyber defenders, based on both deep experience and access to the most deeply classified information held by the United States government. In contrast, industry arguments against cybersecurity legislation appear to have been developed with little or no awareness of the threat facing our nation. Kevin Mandia of the leading security firm Mandiant has explained, for example, that, and I'll quote him, "In over 90% of the cases we have responded to, government notification was required to alert the company that a security breach was underway. In our last 50 incidents," he said, 48 of the victim companies learned they were breached from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Defense, or some other third party. The FBI's experience is similar. When the FBI-led National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force informs an American corporation that it has been hacked, 9 times out of 10, the FBI reports, the corporation had no idea. No idea. In Operation Aurora, the cyber attack which targeted numerous companies, only 3 out of the approximately 300 companies attacked were aware that they had been attacked before they were contacted by the government. These are not unique incidents. Globally, I have said, General Alexander has said, and others have said that America is right now on the losing end of the largest illicit transfer of wealth in human history through cyber attack and through the theft through cyber attack of our intellectual property. So this is an industry-wide problem. Even the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has been the completely unwitting victim of a long-term and extensive cyber intrusion. Just last year, the Wall Street Journal reported that a group of hackers in China breached the computer defenses of the U.S. Chamber, gained access to everything stored on its systems, including information about its 3 million members, and remained on the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's network for at least 6 months and possibly more than a year. The Chamber only learned of the break-in when the FBI told the group that servers in China were stealing its information. Even after the Chamber was notified and increased its cybersecurity, the article stated that the Chamber continued to experience suspicious activity, including, quote, a thermostat at a townhouse the Chamber owns on Capitol Hill communicating with an internet address in China, a printer used by Chamber executives spontaneously printing pages with Chinese characters. And these are the people we're supposed to listen to about cybersecurity. A recent Bloomberg News article makes clear that this was not an isolated incident. It describes how hackers linked to China's army have been seen on the networks of a vast array of American businesses. The article describes how what started as assaults on military and defense contractors have widened into a rash of attacks from which no corporate entity is safe. Among other cyber attacks, Bloomberg News reported, the networks of major oil companies have been harvested for seismic maps charting oil reserves. Saves work if you can just steal that information rather than have to do it yourself. Patent law firms have been hacked for their clients' trade secrets. Again, free access to valuable information. And investment banks have been hacked into for market analysis that might impact the global ventures of certain state-owned, nation-state-owned, foreign country-owned operations. After having been victimized repeatedly by cyber attacks and having learned about them only when the government arrived to help them fix the problem, one would think that critical infrastructure operators and their representatives would be keenly aware of the urgent need for cybersecurity legislation. One would think that they might come to this issue with some sense of humility based on the patent inadequacy of their defenses. And one would think that elected officials sworn to the protection of this country might view with some caution, with some skepticism, claims by folks who are hacked and penetrated virtually at will, usually without even knowing about it, that they can handle this just fine on their own. Yet, industry opposition remains, even after the bill has been revised to include a very business-friendly, voluntary, incentives-based approach to hardening up critical infrastructure that we all depend on. Unfortunately, some colleagues can only hear the siren song of the industry lobbyists, even with plain and ominous national security threats staring them in the face. Some in industry claim that a bill with only information sharing between the government and business would be sufficient, and that protection of critical infrastructure isn't really necessary. This premise is wrong. Statements to the contrary are simply false. Such assertions have been repudiated by the people who we've charged with our nation's defense and who've been confirmed in these roles by the United States Senate, who have repeatedly and as recently as today emphasized the need to protect critical infrastructure. These officials include Secretary of Defense Panetta, Director of National Intelligence Clapper, Attorney General Holder, Secretary of Homeland Security Napolitano, and others. Indeed, it's not just this administration that holds this view. A wide range of national security experts from previous Republican administrations have emphasized the vulnerability of our critical infrastructure, including former Director of National Intelligence and NSA Director Admiral Mike McConnell, former Secretary of Homeland Security Michael Chertoff, and former Assistant Attorney General OLC and now Harvard Law School professor Jack Goldsmith. These people know what they're talking about. They are not kidding around, and they deserve to be listened to. Secretary Chertoff has explained that the existing status quo is not generating adequate cybersecurity for our critical infrastructure. The marketplace, former Secretary of Homeland Security Chertoff has explained, is likely to fail in allocating the correct amount of investment to manage risk across the breadth of the networks on which our society relies. One example of this type of market failure is the decision of gas, electric power, and water utility industries to forego implementation of a powerful new encryption system to shield substations, pipeline compressors, and other key infrastructures from cyber attack because of cost concerns. The cost in this case, it should be noted, would have been approximately $500 per vulnerable device, and they still wouldn't do it. The unwillingness of industry to adopt necessary security standards is particularly troubling when you consider the scope and scale of the risks associated with a failure of critical infrastructure. The current electricity grid knockdown in India, leaving 600 million people without power, shows how bad things can get when critical infrastructure fails. The cause of this massive failure is not clear, and there is not yet any evidence that it was caused by a cyber attack, but it vividly illustrates the vulnerability of humankind when the critical infrastructure we depend on is knocked down, and the terrible, terrible possible consequences of the failure of that critical infrastructure. The scale of the threat we face, the inadequacy the plain inadequacy of current safeguards in the corporate sector and the consequences of failure in this area of critical infrastructure all join together to demand passage of comprehensive cybersecurity legislation. This is a matter of national security. It is our responsibility here in this building to do what we can to make the nation safer, regardless of any parochial interests. Now is the time for us all to come together to get this important job done. I will conclude by saying we are tantalizingly close to having an agreement. And if people will take one last step forward to get that agreement, I think we can do it. If people back away because of the urging of parochial interests, we will fail at this opportunity. And I want to conclude by expressing my congratulations to the chairman of the Committee on Homeland Security and his ranking member, who have really worked hard on this and who have given an enormous amount. We began with a traditional government-run regulatory procedure, which is one that everybody's familiar with. It has lots of checks and balances in it, but it is also a fairly mandatory and top-controlled procedure. And as a result of considerable discussions, bipartisan discussions, a new model emerged that allows the industry immense independence and control in this area. The regime that has been moved to is a huge step by the chairman and the ranking member, begins with a rule that originates in the private sector, has it vetted by experts from the private sector, has a National Institute for Science and Technology review as well, ends up with an array of government agencies approving or disapproving that, and whatever standard is ultimately approved by the Government Council of Agencies, the industry companies are free to opt in or opt out of. If they think that the regulation is unreasonable, they are at liberty to opt out entirely. And a comprehensive liability protection structure has been created to create an inducement for companies to participate, but it is a strong and powerful check on the standard-setting apparatus that ultimately the industry can choose to opt out if it is unreasonable. So an enormous step has been taken by the authors of the current bill towards a compromise. We need a step coming back the other way in order to get this done. I will yield the floor. I see my distinguished colleague from Tennessee here. Let me take one moment as I yield to express my appreciation to Nick Patterson of the Department of Justice, who has been on my staff on assignment from the National Security Division for months and months and months working on this issue. Today is his last day. I want to thank him for his work on this effort. I want to thank the Department of Justice for loaning me him and having them lose this valuable member of their National Security Division to help us develop this legislation. He has been a valuable part of an immensely capable team in my office led by Stephen Lilly that has gotten us to at least where I am today on this legislation. I thank the presiding officer. I thank the senator from Tennessee for his courtesy, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, the Majority Leader is coming to the floor at 6:30, and I recognize that. And when he comes, I'll certainly yield to him. I would like also to thank Nina Imam, who's sitting here with me, who for 2 years has been a fellow from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and has done a terrific job in energy and environmental work. Mr. President, today is Milton Friedman's, the 100th anniversary of Milton Friedman's birthday, the Nobel Prize laureate. And one of his most important statements, in my opinion, was this: nothing is so permanent as a temporary government program. Nothing is so permanent as a temporary government program. It was reported by several media yesterday that Governor Mitt Romney has taken the position that wind production tax credits should be allowed to expire at the end of the year. He must have known Milton Friedman's birthday was coming today. And I wouldn't presume to speak for Milton Friedman, but I think he would applaud Governor Romney's position. It shows a seriousness about our fiscal problems in the United States. It's time to end a temporary tax credit that was put into law in 1992 when President George H.W. Bush was in office and when Milton Friedman was only 80 years old. The wind production tax credit was a temporary tax break, temporary in 1992 to encourage wind power. We give wind developers a 2.2 cent credit for cents for every kilowatt hour of wind electricity produced. And now it's about to expire at the end of the year, and it needs to be extended again, the developers say. Nothing is so permanent as a temporary government program. Just one more time, they tell us. But it's an argument like this that's got us into the fiscal mess that we have as a nation. The United States of America, according to the Joint Tax Committees, is spending $14 billion on subsidizing giant wind turbines over a 5-year period. $6 billion of it is this production tax credit. That's why I'm so pleased to see Governor Romney support the idea of more responsibility in our spending. We spend too much money in Washington that we do not have, and it has to stop. There are many reasons we don't need this particular provision of the tax code. First, we can't afford it. $6 billion over 5 years, in addition to the $8 billion more dollars that have come through grants. At a time when the federal government's borrowing more than 40 cents out of every dollar it spends, we can't afford that, particularly for what the Energy Secretary says is a mature technology. Second, despite all the money, it produces a relatively small amount of electricity, only 2.3% of our electricity in the United States. We're a big country. We use 25% of all the energy in the world, all the electricity in the world. We're not going to operate our country through windmills. Mr. President, I see the Majority Leader here, and I'll be glad to defer to him at this. Third, the massive turbines often destroy the environment in the name of saving it. Some are 50 feet tall, blades as long as a football field, weighing 7 tons, spinning 150 miles an hour. These aren't your grandma's windmills. They're 3 times as tall as the skyboxes at Neyland Stadium at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. There's a new documentary movie about the disturbance in communities. And fourth, the stimulus grants that helped to support it, $1 billion of it went to foreign companies. So, Mr. President, the Majority Leader's come to the floor, and I'll forego my remarks at this time so he'll have a chance to say what he wishes to say.
Majority Leader.
It's my understanding that the distinguished senator from Tennessee wishes to speak for about another 10 minutes. Is that right?
Mr. President, 5 minutes would do it.
Well, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent then that the period for debate only on S3414, the Cybersecurity Act, be extended until 6:40 p.m. today, and that at 6:40 I be recognized.
Without objection.
Mr. President,
Senator from Tennessee.
I thank the Majority Leader for his courtesy, and I'll continue. The fourth reason that we don't need to allow these production tax credits to be renewed is they haven't produced as many American jobs as was claimed. An American University study reported in 2009 that the first $1 billion of stimulus grants to wind went to foreign manufacturing companies. And what do we get in return for that? A puny amount of unreliable electricity generated mostly at night when we don't need it. I mentioned a little earlier that our country is a big country. It uses lots of electricity. The senator from Rhode Island was talking about the problems in India that are being caused by failure of the grid. We need large amounts of reliable baseload electricity to power this country. We're very fortunate that we've, through unconventional gas discoveries, found that we're going to have a lot of cheap gas in the United States. And we can make power plants from natural gas at a low cost and with very clean results in terms of the environment. Nuclear power produces 70% of our carbon-free electricity, 20% of all of our electricity. It needs to be a part of our future mix. So should coal be. I was one of those who voted to require coal plants that operate in the future to have pollution control equipment on them. Therefore, the sulfur, nitrogen, and mercury after a few years for every operating coal plant in the United States will be clean except for carbon, and I'm convinced that such programs as ARPA-E in the Energy Department will find someday what I think is a holy grail of energy, which is a way to find a commercial use for the carbon that comes from coal plants. One of the companies that ARPA-E invests research in, federal research dollars, is experimenting with using a biologic solution that will turn electrodes from unused electricity at night into oil. In other words, create a commercial use, a commercial energy use for the carbon that comes from our coal plants. And when that happens, the United States will have massive amounts of cheap, clean, reliable electricity, and we won't be powering our country with windmills. Even if they are appropriate, Mr. President, on Milton Friedman's birthday, we should congratulate Dr. Friedman for his great career, for his wisdom in pointing out to us that nothing is so permanent as a temporary government program, and applaud Governor Romney for recognizing that and calling for the end of this tax credit. We're coming upon something we call the fiscal cliff. I know the senator from Colorado is very interested in this, spending a lot of time working in a bipartisan way to try to find a way to deal with it. My friend, the foreign minister of Australia, has said to us, he's a great fan of the United States, he said to the United States that we're one budget agreement away from restoring our global preeminence. One budget agreement away from restoring our global preeminence. Now, to get that budget agreement, what do we have to do? Well, we have to deal with appropriations bills at the end of the year. We may have just done that today, or the leaders have recommended it. We have to deal with welfare. We have to deal with the Bush tax cuts. They and the following other items expire at the end of the year. There are tax extenders, as we call them, that need to be renewed or not. There's something called the alternative minimum tax that started out as a tax on rich people and now reaches millions of Americans. There's appropriate payment to doctors who provide medical care. We call it the doc fix. There's the sequester that none of us likes. There's the problem of the debt limit, and that assumes we don't renew the payroll tax cut and extended unemployment benefit insurance. All this is happening at the end of the year. Well, this is a good time to say that to show some seriousness toward dealing with the fiscal cliff, that we need to let a temporary tax break to encourage wind energy that was put in place in 1992 and costs the American people $6 billion over 5 years, we need to let it expire and let wind stand on its own. I would suggest that for that $6 billion, we put $2 of every $3 we save into reducing the debt and $1 into energy research to see if we can find even more amounts of cheap, clean energy. So, Mr. President, it's a good occasion to celebrate Milton Friedman's 100th anniversary of his birthday, and it's a good occasion to applaud Governor Romney for following Milton Friedman's advice. Nothing is so permanent as a temporary government program. I thank the President. I thank the Majority Leader for his courtesy. I yield the floor.
With the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Baca.